All right, at the beginning of this week, many people started celebrating so-called Pride Month. Of course, it's worth pointing out that major news outlets, including USA Today and the Wall Street Journal and others, they've noted that many companies and businesses are not nearly as all in as they have been in years past. And no doubt this is due in large part to the backlash over Bud Light and Target, the fiascos that they both experienced last year. Nonetheless, even if big business has scaled back on its public support of all things LGBT, the Biden administration and their campaign has announced this week that in this month of June, they plan to aggressively campaign at Pride events. So what are we to make of all of this, and how should we respond? Well, joining me now to go over all this in our weekly worldview discussion is David Closson. He, of course, is the director of FRC's Center for Biblical Worldview. David, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to have you.
Great to be with you again, Congressman.
All right, so tell us about the Biden campaign's announcement this week related to Pride Month.
Yeah, this is a pretty significant announcement just a couple of days ago, Jody, where the Biden campaign announced that they want to have a presence at least 200 so-called Pride events, whether that's a parade or a festival or some sort of outing. They want to have campaign officials on the ground and major spokespeople representing the campaign at 200 events. And they kicked this off this past weekend with Kamala Harris, who's kind of running point on some of this. She had a major gathering of about 150 LGBTQ plus activists in Los Angeles, and she wanted to show support and talk about the issues that she thought they cared about. And then even a couple days ago, Jill Biden, the First Lady, I guess, on her way to her son's trial, decided to make a surprise appearance at a Pittsburgh gay pride event. And so it's really interesting to kind of observe this, Jody, that the Biden administration is the campaign is really making an aggressive push, trying to tout all that they're doing for the LGBT activist community. And I got to say, Jody, I'm not at all surprised about this. President Biden has really presided over the most aggressive pro-LGBTQ administration that we've ever seen, from championing legislation like the Equality Act, which would codify sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes. Thank goodness that legislation has not passed, but they were able to get across the finish line the so-called Respect for Marriage Act that codified gay marriage. They've rewritten Title IX, the legislation that's supposed to protect women and girls, to now protect the categories of sexual orientation, gender identity, and biological men who want to identify as women. So not at all surprised, Jody, that this is where the campaign's wanting to divert their attention and their resources.
Well, and obviously with 200 different desired events to attend for the Biden campaign, do you know if the president himself is going to be attending any of these, or is that still a wait and see?
I think it's a wait and see for some of the events, but already they have announced that kind of towards the end of the month, they're going to kind of culminate the so-called celebration of Pride with a huge fundraiser in New York City that the president has already stated that he plans to be the keynote speaker. So it's not just Biden campaign surrogates. It's the First Lady, it's the Vice President, and you better believe it'll be the president himself waving that rainbow flag.
Well, it's a huge statement. Let's kind of compare, if you can, David, in terms of the campaign. There's quite a difference, a contrast in how the Biden and the Trump campaigns are messaging on LGBT issues. What have you seen in terms of messaging? How much of the divide is there, do you think, between Biden and Trump when it comes to religious liberties in particular? That's the main area that I'm concerned and kind of pushing for your response here. When it comes to LGBT lobbying and pushing, what's the messaging between the two campaigns, specifically to religious liberty?
Yeah, I think when you look at the Trump campaign, kind of the main issues that they're focused on is crime, it's the economy, so-called Bidenomics, it's obviously immigration and the border. So this is not an issue they're really running heavily on. However, I do know that the Trump campaign, when they've had opportunity, they have highlighted the importance of religious freedom. whereas the Biden campaign really is kind of all in on this whole gamut of LGBT issues. But I think what's important, and this is what's kind of interesting about the times we live in when you have Trump versus Biden, Jody, is that we can actually look. We don't have to guess kind of what the second Trump administration would look like, because we have a 4-year record as far as what the Trump administration did on issues related to religious liberty. Just a couple of things to remind our viewers. It was under the Trump administration that the State Department every year put a major ministerial together with dozens of nations around the world coming together to talk about how they could protect religious freedom. One of the first things the administration did actually in 2017 was to put out an executive order making sure that religious freedom was seen as something that was protected under American law. A couple other things, Jody, that we could point out. The Justice Department under the Trump administration filed an amicus brief supporting Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker that kind of every LGBT activist seems to always gun for every year. And even during COVID, under the Trump administration, the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, made sure that clergy members were designated as essential support workers, and they made sure that the conscience rights of doctors were protected, so that you couldn't force a doctor who had religious objections to abortion to perform an abortion. You couldn't coerce someone with religious beliefs related to transgenderism to do a surgery that would pump someone full of hormones or puberty blockers. So the Trump administration really focused on that. And even the Department of Justice during COVID, my own church, Jody, Capitol Hill Baptist Church just down the street from here, when we sued Mayor Bowser for not letting us have the same rights that so-called peaceful protests were allowed to have, the Trump administration actually filed a statement of interest in federal court. So when it comes to religious liberty, Jody, the contrast between the Biden administration and then the first Trump administration is actually quite stark.
Yeah, it really is. And, I think we're hitting on the issue why Christians really need to be paying attention to this issue. This is not simply an issue of sexual preference or whatever. This goes far beyond that to impact your church, my church, our religious liberties, the doctors where they work, where people, be it teachers at school or wherever it is they work. This has religious liberty ramifications across the board, does it not?
No, it really does. And, I think these conversations that we're having right now, Jody, this is not just a conversation for eggheads or people that just live for public policy or the ivory tower intellectuals. Elections really do have consequences. And, you look, I'll give you one example in particular. Look at the issue of the so-called, transgender surgeries, where you have the Biden administration is all in favor of allowing minor children, if they identify as transgender, to be pumped with hormone blockers and puberty blockers, even to get physical surgeries to chop off healthy body parts. That's public policy. That's law. It affects our children. It affects people in really practical ways. And all of that flows downstream from a governing philosophy, which ultimately flows down from a worldview. And I think you do see that there's really contrasting worldviews today represented by the major political parties.
Oh, there's no question about that. This whole issue, David, is no longer just about the LGBT movement seeking affirmation. This has really come to the point where those in the movement are trying to force their supporters and even their opponents. They want to force everyone, if you will, to bow their knee. And they want to demonize anyone who refuses to bow the knee to them. And that's what makes this such a frightening time. If I can shift gears, though, with you, there was also some major news related to the United Methodist Church this week. Can you bring us up to speed on that?
Yeah, really interesting. So this has been in the news the last couple of years. The United Methodist Church is like the second largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And for years, there's been like this internal battle and division amongst kind of theological liberals, theological conservatives over the issue of same-sex marriage, ordination of those who identify as gay. And because of the pressure of those who are theologically conservative, largely from Africa and Asian countries, the denomination split last year. And, conservative churches were given an opportunity to actually leave the denomination with their property, with their assets, and thousands of United Methodist churches withdrew. And so just a couple of weeks ago, Jody, those who remained in the United Methodist Church wasted no time to completely rewrite doctrine. They went from, saying same-sex marriage was against the Bible, that homosexuality was something that Scripture condemned, to 180 and saying homosexuality was morally fine, it was morally praiseworthy, it's okay to ordain someone who identifies as gay or transgender, just a complete 180. And just a couple of days ago, the United Methodist Church that's in the Ivory Coast, about 1.2 million members of the United Methodist Church who are in the Ivory Coast, that denomination, or that part of the denomination, announced that they were leaving immediately. Jody, what's significant about that is that particular part of the church constitutes 10% of all United Methodists. And so in one day, the United Methodist denomination lost 10% of their members. And what was really fascinating, and I think everyone should pay attention to, is the reason that these Ivory Coast bishops gave. And the reason that they said it was for reasons of conscience before God and before His Word. And they said the mainline leaders have sacrificed their honorability and integrity to honor the LGBT. That's the quote that they said. So I just think the courage of these bishops in Africa to look at kind of the Western elites, and they're looking at that and saying, we can't go along with that because Scripture doesn't go along with that. So major development that I think will go down in the annals of church history, to be honest.
Yeah, it's amazing to me and encouraging that literally for centuries, missionaries have gone to the Ivory Coast and to different places of Africa for years and years and years, taking the gospel, and now they have embraced it, and they now are leading the way spiritually and biblically, at least in these examples you've given us with the United Methodist Church. In fact, they were the ones that started this whole split, as you referenced earlier. It's absolutely amazing. I think anyone who has been paying attention to these things, watching some of these major denominations take a 180-degree change in direction on biblical issues, specifically marriage and sexuality, what do they do with the Bible? I mean, when they are writing new bylaws, like you say, and they say now, new revelation or whatever, it's okay to embrace, if you will, same-sex marriages and bishops and this. What have they done with the Bible?
Yeah, I'll put it shortly, Jody. They've thrown the Bible overboard. And I think we need to realize this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the kind of mainline Protestantism, the main 7 denominations, you think of the United Methodist Church, Presbyterian USA, other mainline denominations. These are the same denominations that about 100 years ago, think 1920s, even maybe a little bit before that, those are the churches that were initially affected really by German higher criticism, theological liberalism. These are the same churches that begin to get embarrassed by things like the virgin birth, a literal resurrection, the authority and inerrancy of the Scripture. They kind of got embarrassed of those doctrines, so they quit teaching them in their seminaries and their churches. And so a generation later, in the 1960s and 70s, when culture began to change on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and homosexuality, well, guess what? Those denominations were no longer standing on the Bible, so no wonder that those are the churches that began to change their positions because they were already no longer looking to the Bible for any guidance whatsoever. It's a reminder, Jody, theology always matters.
It really does. And speaking of that, another silver lining, in our time's getting away, we've only got a little over a minute left, but another recent survey came out that showed that most pastors continue to oppose same-sex marriage. What do we make of this report?
Yeah, the statistic from Lifeway, the way they put it is it's 21% of Protestant pastors said they saw nothing wrong with same-sex marriage, and that's actually down from a few years ago. About 5 years ago, it was 24% of Protestant pastors said, there was nothing wrong with it. So it's actually down, which is, I think, encouraging and interesting. I will say, though, it's important to look at the denomination. You could hear, wow, 21%, that's kind of a high number. Well, when you look at like evangelicals, you break that out, only 7% of evangelicals would affirm same-sex marriage is morally permissible. And Jody, we shouldn't be surprised because evangelicals, as a group. This would be conservative Baptists, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, are the denominations that are still holding to the inerrancy, the authority, and the infallibility of Scripture. When you stand on Scripture, you're going to teach the Bible as it says, and the Bible has clear teaching on these issues as well as many others.
David Closson, always great to have you for our Worldview segment here on Washington Watch. Thank you so much for breaking all this down for us today. We appreciate it. I hope you have a fantastic weekend.
You too. Thank you, Jody.